He drove 4 hours through the Alberta winter to say goodbye, and what he found when he walked through his mother's front door made him sit down on the floor of the hallway like a boy. Callum Rourke. No, wait. Let me start over with the names. Actually, let me check the names list and write the story directly. Hugh Mercer had not been back to Medicine Hat in 11 months. He told himself it was the distance. Calgary to Medicine Hat was a 4-hour drive on a good day. Longer in February when the Trans-Canada turned mean and white. He told himself it was the Pemberton acquisition. The deal that had consumed his firm for 8 months straight. The deal that had made his name in every financial boardroom west of Toronto. He told himself a lot of things in the back of town cars and on quiet flights between cities, and most of them were true enough to live with. The call came on a Thursday evening, not from his mother, from Rosa. Rosa Delgado had been working in the Mercer house for 4 months. She had been hired through an agency in Calgary after the previous home support worker left. Something about scheduling conflicts, something Harold the estate manager had handled while Hugh was in Vancouver. Hugh had approved the hire by email. He had not asked follow-up questions. Rosa's voice on the phone was calm, careful. The way people spoke when they had decided to say something they weren't sure they were allowed to say. Mr. Mercer, I'm sorry to bother you. It's about your mother. His hand tightened around the phone. She's okay, physically okay, but she hasn't eaten properly in almost 2 weeks. She's been very quiet. I think you should come. Hugh said he would be there by morning. He did not ask why Rosa was the one calling instead of the agency supervisor. He did not ask what very quiet meant for a woman who had always filled every room she entered. He left at 5 in the morning. The highway was dark and glassy with cold. His mother's name was Margaret Mercer. She was 79 years old. The widow of a man who had built a regional construction empire with his hands and his word, and for most of Hugh's life she had been the kind of woman who laughed too loud at dinner parties, and argued with the radio in the kitchen, and kept a garden so large the neighbors called it her third child. She had suffered a stroke 14 months ago. Her left side had been affected, her hand, her arm, the corner of her mouth. Speech therapy had helped, slowly. The doctors said she was making progress. The reports Hugh received monthly said stable. Some improvement, no significant regression. He had read all the reports. He arrived just after 9 in the morning. The house was a large stone bungalow on the south side of Medicine Hat, set back from a quiet street behind a row of spruce trees that Margaret had planted herself when Hugh was 12. The driveway had been shoveled clean. Someone had put out a small wreath on the door, dried orange slices and cinnamon sticks, the kind of thing his mother used to make every November before the stroke took the steadiness from her left hand. Hugh sat in the car for a moment, then he heard it. Music coming from inside the house. Faint through the front door and the storm glass. Something old, something with piano. He hadn't heard music in this house in over a year. He went in without knocking. The front hall smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and the music was clearer now. An old Patsy Cline record. The one his mother used to play on Sunday mornings when his father was still alive, and the world was still a certain kind of whole. Hugh followed the sound down the hall to the sitting room, the one with the south-facing window that his mother had always loved for its afternoon light. The door was half open. Inside, the winter sun was falling flat and golden across the hardwood floor. His mother sat in the chair she'd had for 30 years, the one with the wide armrests and the blue cushion she'd reupholstered herself in 2011. She was wrapped in a heavy cardigan, her silver hair was combed and pinned back, and she was moving. Not much. Just her right hand, the good hand, tracing small slow circles on the armrest, like she was conducting something only she could hear. And across from her, kneeling on the floor with a cup of tea in her hands that she was gently offering up, like a gift, like something that required permission, was a young woman Hugh had never seen before. She was maybe 28, dark hair pulled back with a clip that looked like it had been borrowed from a teenager. She was wearing jeans and a fleece pullover the color of old sage. No uniform, no lanyard, nothing clinical about her at all. She was talking, not at Margaret, not about Margaret to her. I still can't figure out if it was the needle or the record, she was saying, her voice low and easy, like she was continuing a conversation that had been going on for a while. My grandfather had this same album, and every time track 4 started it would stick. Just da-da-da-da-da-da forever. He'd have to get up and bump the shelf, and my grandmother would roll her eyes like it was a personal failing. Margaret Mercer made a sound. It was small, rough around the edges, but it had shape and it had direction, and it was unmistakably laughter. Hugh's hand went to the doorframe. He hadn't heard that sound in 14 months, not since the stroke. The therapist had said emotional response was intact, that she understood, that she was present. But the reports had also said limited verbal output, reduced social engagement, minimal expressive affect. Those were the words he had used to explain her to himself, to describe a woman whose entire life had been made of warmth and noise. He had turned her into a medical summary, and standing in the hallway of her own house he felt the weight of that. The young woman looked up. She saw Hugh in the doorway and her expression changed. Not guilty, not startled. Something steadier than that. She set the tea carefully on the side table and rose from the floor. Hugh stepped into the room. His mother turned her head. And for one long second he was afraid. Afraid she wouldn't recognize him. Afraid the gap had grown too wide. Afraid of exactly what 14 months of distance could do. Then Margaret Mercer's right hand lifted. Not toward the young woman. Toward him. Mom, his voice came out wrong. Too young. Like he was 9 years old again and had fallen off his bike at the end of this very street. He crossed the room. He knelt beside her chair the way the young woman had been kneeling. And he took her hand, and it felt the same as it always had. A little rough from years of gardening. Warm in that specific way that meant she was home and he was safe. And he pressed it between both of his and he could not speak. Rosa Delgado stood by the window, quiet and patient, giving him something he hadn't earned but desperately needed. After a long moment, Margaret squeezed his hand. Once firmly with the deliberateness of someone who had learned to make each movement carry everything it needed to say. Hugh looked up. Rosa spoke softly from across the room. She does that every morning now, she said, the squeezing. She started about 3 weeks ago. He turned toward her slowly. Every morning, yes. Those 2 words sat in the room like stones dropped in water. The circles were still spreading when Hugh finally stood. He straightened his jacket, the old reflex. The thing he did when something moved inside him that he didn't know how to hold. How long, he said, has she been like this? Eating better, I mean. Responding. Rosa looked at Margaret before she answered. About 3 weeks, give or take. It was small things at first. A pause. No one told you? Hugh looked toward the hallway where the estate manager, a careful man named Gerald, had appeared and was now looking very busy studying a framed photograph of the Rockies. Hugh's voice dropped. Gerald, not a question. Gerald appeared in the doorway. Mr. Mercer, I can put together a report. Yes. You can, tonight. Hugh turned back to Rosa. What exactly have you been doing with her? Rosa looked at him with an evenness that was not quite deference and not quite challenge. Spending time, she said, talking to her. Playing music, asking her what she wants. She can't always answer. She always answers. Rosa said it quietly, without any drama in it at all. Just not always in words that landed differently than Hugh expected. He stood there a moment trying to find the angle of the statement, the flattery, the performance, the agenda, and found nothing. She was just saying what she believed. Rosa stepped toward the chair slowly, so that Margaret could see her coming. She'll look away if the tea's too hot, she said. She'll tap twice on the armrest if she wants the radio on. A small gesture toward the arm of the chair. She taps once if she's not sure. She likes the Patsy Cline but not the Shania Twain. She made that very clear the second week. Something like a smile crossed Rosa's face. She has opinions, she just needed some to ask. Hugh looked at his mother. Margaret was watching Rosa with an expression that did not belong in any medical report. Warm, alert, specific. The face of a woman tracking someone she trusted. In 14 months Hugh had arranged 2 neurologists, a speech therapist, 3 different home support agencies, a stairlift, handrails, a hospital-grade mattress, a meal delivery subscription and a weekly nursing check-in. He had read every report, he had paid every invoice. He had sat beside her bed in the early weeks and held her hand and told her to fight, and then gone back to Calgary and filed the folder away somewhere behind the Pemberton acquisition and the offshore accounts and the quarterly reviews. He had paid for everything. He had not asked what she wanted to listen to. The shame arrived slowly, the way real shame always does, not a wave but a tide, patient and cold. I thought the nurses were handling her care, he said. Rosa folded her hands in front of her. They handle her medical needs, she said. That's different. Hugh looked at her. She was not afraid of him. Not many people in his life were not afraid of him. Or at least not afraid of what he could do. What he could approve or not approve. What he could take away or redirect. Rosa Delgado looked at him the way someone looked at a person when they had already decided to tell the truth, and were just waiting for the right moment. She was lonely, Rosa said. That's what it was. She wasn't declining. She was lonely. The grandfather clock in the corner counted seconds. Outside, a chickadee landed on the snow-covered rail of the back fence and was gone again. Hugh said nothing. He had nothing to say. He spent that afternoon in his old bedroom going through the agency reports, the nursing notes, the speech therapy updates. He read them all again but differently now. He was not looking for reassurance. He was looking for what was missing. The reports mentioned vital signs, meal completion percentages, sleep patterns, medication compliance. They mentioned emotional flatness and reduced motivation and occasional agitation. They did not mention what music she liked. They did not mention that she'd developed her own way of saying yes. They did not mention the garden she used to tend, or whether she'd been placed where she could see the yard or turned away from it. They were thorough documents. They described someone who was mostly gone. Hugh closed the folder and sat in the winter quiet of a room that still had his high school hockey trophies on the shelf, and a crack in the ceiling he had made with a lacrosse ball in 1987, and had never told his parents about. He thought about the person those reports described. He thought about the woman across the hall who had laughed at a story about a skipping record. He called down to Gerald. Get me a full account of every agency worker who has had contact with my mother in the last 14 months, hours, duties, supervisor notes, everything. Gerald said yes, Mr. Mercer. Hugh heard the relief in the man's voice. The relief of being given a task that looked like control, that looked like the Hugh Mercer they all knew. The one who solved things by acquiring information and issuing directives. Hugh hung up and sat back down. He did not feel like himself. He was starting to think that might be the point. Dinner that evening was quiet. Hugh ate in the kitchen while Rosa sat across from Margaret in the sitting room, and walked her through a slow, patient meal. A bowl of soup from scratch, thickened the way the speech therapist had recommended, but seasoned the way Margaret apparently preferred, with dill and a little white pepper, which Hugh had not known about because no report had ever mentioned it. He stood in the doorway and watched. Rosa narrated the whole thing in her easy, low voice. This is from that butternut squash Gerald brought in last week. I think he grew it himself and is too proud to admit it. She paused, held up the spoon, waited. Margaret's right hand tapped the armrest once. Too hot? Margaret's eyes moved toward the bowl. Rosa set the spoon down and waited without checking her phone, without glancing toward the clock on the wall, without doing any of the small things people did when they were waiting on behalf of someone else. She just waited. When the soup had cooled a degree or two, Rosa tried again. This time Margaret opened her mouth. Hugh gripped the doorframe. The speech therapist's last report had said minimal oral intake during sessions, patient uncooperative with feeding exercises. 3 sentences, a billing code. A recommendation to try a different thickener. What the report had not said was that Margaret Mercer did not want to be fed. She wanted to be asked. Rosa caught Hugh watching from the doorway. She didn't say anything. She turned back to Margaret with the same attention she had given her all day. And Hugh slid back down the hall feeling something he had not felt in a boardroom or on a golf course or in the back of a town car in a very long time. He felt ashamed, and he felt grateful, and he didn't yet know what to do with either. He called Diane that night from the den. Diane Forsyth had been his companion for 2 years, a sharp, composed woman who ran a strategic communications firm out of Calgary, and wore her ambition the way other people wore jewelry, openly and without apology. She was good company. She was good for events and for dinners and for the particular silence of a hotel room in another city. She was someone who understood the schedule. "You're still there," she said when he answered, the way she said most things. Not quite a question, not quite anything else. "I'm staying tonight," Hugh said. "You said one day." "I know." A pause. "Is she worse?" He looked out the window at the frozen backyard, at the garden his mother had made from nothing. The raised beds still there under their caps of snow. The old apple tree, the rose trellis buried to its crossbars. "She's better," he said, "actually better." "I didn't know." Didn't know what? He didn't answer right away. He was trying to find a way to explain what he had seen today. The music, the tap, the laughter, the soup with dill. To someone who would understand it as a category of problem to manage. "I didn't know she was still in there," he said finally. "I mean, I knew. The doctor said she understood things." He stopped. "Hugh." Diane's voice was gentle. "You've done everything you could for her. You've spent." "I know what I've spent," he said. Silence. "That's not what she needed," he said. Another silence, this one wider. He went to bed in his old room and lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling crack and the hockey trophies and the photograph of himself and his parents at a lake in the Kootenays when he was maybe 14. All 3 of them squinting into the same summer sun. He had not taken a photograph with his mother since the stroke. In the morning he was in the sitting room before Rosa arrived. He had brought the photo album from the den. The one his mother had kept on the bottom shelf for decades. The one with the brittle plastic sleeves and the pictures that went back to the 1960s. He set it on the side table and sat in the chair beside the window, and waited for his mother to be brought down from her room. When Rosa wheeled the chair in and saw him, she stopped briefly in the doorway. Then she brought Margaret all the way in and angled the chair toward the window and the south light, the way Hugh had seen her do the day before. "Good morning," Hugh said, to his mother, looking at her, not around her. Margaret turned her head. Her eyes settled on him slowly and then they focused. "Do you remember this one?" He opened the album to a photograph from 1979. His mother and father standing in front of a half-built house somewhere in the Crow's Nest Pass, both of them covered in drywall dust, laughing. His father's arm around her shoulder. His mother's chin tilted up like she was about to say something wonderful. He waited. He had never been good at waiting. His whole professional life had been built on the opposite. On momentum, on decision, on the compression of time into deliverables and deadlines. Waiting felt like loss of ground, but he waited now. 5 seconds, 8:12. Margaret Mercer's right hand lifted from the armrest. Her fingers trembled once and then they tapped twice, deliberate. Hugh's throat closed. "Yeah," he managed. "I remember too." Rosa made a small sound from across the room. Not a word. Just the sound of someone who was glad. Hugh turned to her. "How do I know if she's happy with something versus just acknowledging it?" Rosa came closer. She crouched slightly so she was eye level with Margaret. "Watch her eyes," she said. "With the tapping, the eyes tell you the rest. If she looks away after, she's done. If she looks at you, she wants more." Margaret was looking at Hugh. "More," Rosa confirmed softly with a smile. Hugh turned another page. They stayed like that for almost an hour, the three of them, in the winter light of a room where Patsy Cline played low on an old wireless speaker, and the snow came down outside in long slow curtains, and a woman who had been described in 12 months of reports as showing limited engagement pointed with one trembling finger at a photograph of herself, as a young woman standing in a garden and tapped twice firmly and then looked at her son. "That's the garden," Hugh said. "You planted that the first spring after you moved in." Dad thought it was too big. He shook his head. He was always wrong about that. 2 taps. Rosa laughed quietly. So eventually did Hugh. It was the first time he had laughed in this house in longer than he could name. He went back to Calgary the following day. He told himself it was the Pemberton Post close filings, the International Review, the obligations that had stacked up during the 48 hours of his absence. He sat in the back of the town car and answered emails with the steady mechanical efficiency that had made him very successful and very present in every room that was not the one that mattered. His phone buzzed with a message from Diane. "Dinner Thursday?" He stared at it for a long time. "I'll let you know," he wrote back. He did not feel like himself on the drive back. The highway was flat and white, and the sky was the specific gray of a Canadian February that looked like nothing and held everything. And Hugh Mercer sat with his hands in his lap, and thought about his mother pointing at a photograph of a garden she had made with her own hands and tapping twice for yes, and the way she had looked at him afterward. Not like a patient, not like a woman waiting to be managed, but like a mother checking to see if her son was still in there. He went back the following weekend. He did not tell anyone he was going, he just went. Rosa was already there when he arrived. She had Margaret at the kitchen table, not the sitting room, the kitchen, where the light was warm and the windows looked out over the backyard. She was showing Margaret a seed catalog, turning the pages slowly, pausing at each one. Margaret's right hand moved from page to page. Sometimes she tapped, sometimes she just rested her fingers on an image and left them there. "Roses," Rosa said when Hugh came in. "She keeps coming back to the roses." Hugh hung his coat on the hook by the door. The same hook where his coat had hung as a child. The same wooden hook with the rooster painted on it that his mother had found at a flea market in Lethbridge, and came to stand beside the table. His mother looked up at him. The surprise in her face lasted only a second, then something else replaced it. "He came back," Rosa said quietly to Margaret, as if translating. A week early, Margaret looked at Hugh. Her right hand moved to the open page of the seed catalog, to a photograph of a climbing rose. Deep red, the old-fashioned kind, the kind that bloomed once and mattered. 2 taps. "You want to plant them again this year?" Hugh asked. His mother looked at him with an expression that was unmistakably a raised eyebrow. Rosa covered her mouth. "I think that means obviously." Hugh sat down at his mother's kitchen table, in the chair he had sat in for every breakfast of his childhood, and he looked at the seed catalog and he said, "All right, show me what you want." And Margaret Mercer, who had not spoken more than fragments in 14 months, who had been described as showing minimal expressive motivation, who had eaten barely enough to be called eating, turned the pages of the catalog with her one steady hand and pointed and tapped and looked at her son, and did not stop for 40 minutes. Diane Forsyth arrived that Saturday afternoon. She had driven herself, which was unusual. She came in the front door with a bottle of wine and a bag from a good Calgary bakery and a smile that was warm in all the right places. Hugh met her in the hall. "I thought you could use the company," she said. He hadn't told her he was coming here. "How did you know?" "Gerald mentioned it." She said it easily. "Don't be annoyed with him." Hugh was a little annoyed with him, but he let it go. Diane greeted his mother the way she always did. A bright smile, a brief touch on the shoulder, a comment about the house looking lovely. It was not unkind. It was exactly as warm as a certain kind of person learned to be with elderly relatives. The warmth of competence of someone who knew the appropriate register and hit it precisely. Margaret looked at her. No tap, no smile. Nothing unkind. Just the steady, undeceivable attention of a woman who had spent 79 years reading people in rooms. Rosa set out tea and excused herself to the laundry, the way she always did when the family had visitors. Not coldly, not pointedly, just with the practiced discretion of someone who understood which parts of a house were hers to inhabit and which weren't. Diane sat beside Margaret. She spoke brightly, asking questions that didn't require answers. "Isn't the light nice at this time of day? Hugh tells me you used to have beautiful roses. This house must have such wonderful history." And Margaret listened, and her face stayed polite and neutral and carefully nothing. Hugh watched. He had seen his mother look at Rosa during a conversation about a skipping record, and her face had been entirely different. There had been a woman in that face. There was a woman in it right now too, but she had closed a door. Diane noticed. She adjusted, smoothly. She directed her attention toward Hugh instead, asking about the post-close schedule, the January review. A mutual colleague's situation in Vancouver. It was easy and familiar, and Hugh found himself answering without thinking, slipping back into the person he was in Calgary, the person he wore there like a well-cut coat. Margaret's hand moved, one tap on the armrest. Hugh stopped mid-sentence. "One tap." Rosa had said one tap meant maybe, but it also meant, sometimes I need something. It depended on the eyes. He turned. His mother was looking at the doorway toward the kitchen, toward where Rosa had gone. Hugh said, Mom, do you want Rosa to come back? Margaret looked at him. 2 taps. Diane set down her teacup. Hugh raised his voice slightly. Rosa, could you come in? Rosa appeared in the doorway with a folded dish towel in her hands. She looked at Margaret, then at the room, then she understood what she was looking at. She came in quietly and took up her usual spot near the side table, and Margaret's face settled. The closed door opened. Just a little. Diane watched this. Her expression stayed pleasant. But Hugh had spent 2 years with her, and he knew what pleasant over something else looked like. That evening, after his mother had been settled for the night, Hugh and Diane stood in the kitchen while the cold pressed itself against the window glass. She's very involved, Diane said. Rosa? She seems to have made herself rather central. Hugh was quiet for a moment. My mother is better than she's been in over a year, I know. That's wonderful. Diane turned her wineglass slowly. I only wonder if it's healthy. This level of attachment, for both of them. Your mother is a young woman in that position. What position? Diane met his eyes. Her tone was careful, reasonable, the tone of someone making a point that couldn't be argued with on its face. Hugh, you don't know her very well. She's been here 4 months. She's developed a significant relationship with your mother, and now she seems to be determining what Margaret needs and when and how. That's a lot of influence for someone you hired through an agency. Hugh thought about Rosa kneeling on the floor with a cup of tea like it was something sacred. He thought about the seed catalog and the 40 minutes of pointing. He thought about his mother's face when Rosa came back into the room. She makes her feel like a person, he said. Diane blinked. Of course she does, that's what she's paid for. The sentence sat between them. Hugh set down his own glass. He said, I don't think that's what's happening here. Diane's eyes sharpened very slightly. I just think you should be careful about letting an employee set the emotional tone of your mother's care. That's your responsibility. It shouldn't be delegated. The word delegated did something to the air in the room, because that was exactly what Hugh had done for 14 months. He had delegated. He had built a system of delegation so complete and well-funded that he never had to be present at all, and he had called that care. And the woman in the next room had almost disappeared inside it. You're right, Hugh said, that it's my responsibility. Diane nodded, satisfied. But not for the reasons you mean, he said. Sunday morning Hugh was in the kitchen making coffee at 7 when Rosa came in the back door, stamping snow from her boots. She stopped when she saw him. You're up early, couldn't sleep. He poured her a cup. Sit down. She sat carefully, the way people sat in other people's kitchens when they weren't sure what kind of conversation was coming. Hugh put the cup in front of her and sat across the table. Diane thinks you've overstepped, he said. He said it plainly without softening it, because he thought she deserved the plain version. She thinks you have too much influence in my mother's care. Rosa wrapped both hands around the cup. She looked at it. And Hugh was quiet for a long moment. Outside a nuthatch was working its way down the trunk of the old spruce, head first the way they always did. His mother used to point them out to him when he was a boy. Cheeky little birds, she'd say. Going the wrong way on purpose, I think. That you've done something I should have done myself, and I'm grateful for it, and I'm angry at myself, not at you. Rosa looked up. I also think, he said, that Diane may be a smarter person than she is a kind one. And I've spent 2 years confusing those things. Rosa said nothing. But she held the cup a little less carefully. My mother chose you, Hugh said. When she tapped for you to come back into the room yesterday, she chose you. I'm not going to overrule her. He paused. She gets to choose. Rosa looked down, her jaw moved once. When she looked up again her eyes were bright. She's been doing that a lot lately, she said. Choosing, it started small, which cardigan, whether to have the radio on, whether she wanted the curtains fully open or just halfway. She shook her head. Small choices, but she makes them. The reports I get don't mention that. No, Rosa said, they don't. They sat in the winter kitchen while the coffee went warm, and the light came up pale and clean over the snow-covered garden, and Hugh Mercer began, cautiously with many wrong questions and some good ones, to learn how his mother spent her days. The rose catalogs arrived by mail 2 weeks later. Hugh had ordered 3 different ones. Canadian prairie varieties, all late season, all hardy to Zone 3. He drove them out on a Friday after the markets closed, and he and Margaret went through them page by page at the kitchen table, while Rosa made tea and the light shifted from gold to gray and back again. Margaret's hand moved steadily. She paused at a photograph of a William Baffin climber, hot pink, vigorous, built for cold, and set her finger down on it. That one? Hugh asked. 2 taps. You want it on the trellis again? 2 taps. I'll order 4, 2 for either side. His mother looked at him. Her right hand moved up from the table, slowly with effort, and found his hand where it rested on the cover of the catalog. She pressed it once. Not a tap, a hold. Hugh turned his hand over and held hers back. Rosa stood at the counter and looked out at the garden, giving them the moment without comment. After a while Margaret made a small sound. Hugh looked up. She was watching him with the focused, measuring expression she'd had all his life. The expression that meant she was going to say something worth hearing. If he would only be patient enough to wait for it. He waited. Her lips moved, her breath shifted. The right side of her face barely moved, but the left side lifted, unevenly with effort. A sound, a shape. Hugh Mercer, who ran a company with 400 employees and who had not cried in public since his father's funeral, put his forehead down on his mother's hand and did not speak for a long time. Rosa set down the teacup she was holding quietly. She slipped out of the kitchen and stood in the hallway and gave them the room. Outside, the garden waited under its snow. The old trellis stood bare against the gray Alberta sky. But in 4 months, maybe 5 depending on the spring, Margaret Mercer was going to tell someone where to plant the roses, and her son was going to be there to do it. When Hugh finally raised his head, his eyes were wet and he didn't bother to hide it. "I'm here," he said to her. "I'm going to keep being here." Margaret looked at him. 2 taps. And for once Hugh Mercer understood that being told yes was the most important thing that had ever happened in any room he'd ever stood in. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. They were something smaller and truer than that. They were adjustments, corrections, the slow revision of a man who had spent years believing that provision was the same as presence, and was finally willing to learn the difference. He cancelled a trip to Toronto. He rescheduled the Hong Kong call to a time that didn't eat into Friday afternoons. He started driving to Medicine Hat every second weekend, sometimes every weekend. And he stopped explaining it to people at the office, the way you stopped explaining things you had decided were simply true. He learned 2 taps from 1 tap. He learned that Margaret liked the CBC afternoon program but found the evening news too loud. He learned she still had preferences about sweater colors. She would tap once for the beige one and twice for the green one. And if someone handed her the wrong one anyway, she would hold it for a moment, and then set it aside with a patience that had always been in her, but that Hugh was only now slow enough to see. He learned to sit beside her without needing to fill the silence. That had been the hardest part, it turned out, the silence. He had always experienced silence as something that wanted fixing. In boardrooms he called it dead air. In relationships he called it drift. But in his mother's sitting room, silence was where she lived now, and it was warm in there and there was room for 2 people if one of them stopped being afraid of it. Diane did not call after the Sunday morning in the kitchen. Hugh waited a week, then called her. The conversation was short and honest and not unkind. He said he needed to spend time in Medicine Hat that he couldn't give to anything else right now. She said she understood, and he believed she did understand, and that the understanding had nothing to do with agreeing with him. They ended the call with a mutual and genuine goodwill that surprised him. He thought about it afterward. He thought about 2 years of a relationship in which he had consistently prioritized the calendar over the calendar item, and whether that was the same as prioritizing someone. He did not arrive at a flattering conclusion. He filed it somewhere he could find it again. Rosa stayed. He had wondered about that. Briefly, whether now that he was more present, the arrangement would need to change. Whether his mother would need less from Rosa with her son around more. But what he discovered was something different. Something he should perhaps have understood from the beginning. His mother did not need less from Rosa because she had more from Hugh. She needed both in the specific and irreplaceable ways that each of them offered. Rosa brought the ease of daily continuity, the language they had built together over months, the music, the soup with dill and white pepper, the morning rhythm that made Margaret's world legible and hers. Hugh brought something different. He brought the history that only he could carry, the photographs, the rose trellis, the memory of his father building things, the long line of time that said, "You are still you and your life has meant something." They were not interchangeable. They were not in competition. His mother had known this before either of them did. On an afternoon in late March, when the snow had finally begun to give up the garden, reluctantly in patches, the way winter always left Alberta, Hugh was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee when Rosa appeared in the doorway behind him. "She's asking for you," Rosa said. He set down the cup and went to the sitting room. Margaret was in her chair by the window, and outside the window the February rose trellis was still bare. But the soil around its base was visible now, dark and thawing, and 2 fat robins were doing their investigative rounds along the garden edge. Margaret was watching them. Her right hand rested on the arm of the chair. When Hugh sat beside her she didn't look away from the window. He followed her gaze. "They're back," he said. Early this year his mother's hand moved. Tap tap. "You happy about that?" Her hand moved again. 2 taps and then, slowly with effort, with the particular labor of a woman who was rebuilding something that had been taken from her piece by hard she turned her head and looked at her son. Her lips moved. She said. Rough and imprecise, but directed at him, meant for him, alive with everything she still held inside her. Hugh sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment. "Me too," he said. Rosa stood in the doorway, unseen, the dish towel in her hands, and did not interrupt. Outside, the robins worked the garden edge in the thin March light. And the old rose trellis stood patient in the half-thawed ground, waiting for spring. There are people in every house who see what others stop looking for. They arrive through the back door. They learn the language no one else thought to learn. They stay when it would have been easier to leave. They are not famous for this. Most of the time no one writes it down, but the people they looked after remember. And sometimes if we're paying attention, so do we. What would you have done differently? As a son, a daughter, or the one who stayed? Leave a comment below and subscribe to Echoes of Hope 8 for more stories about the quiet moments that change everything.